So what's the difference between the early and the late romantics? Why do we group them into these two groups? So as you remember, the figures that were included in the early romantics, these were Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake. Uh, and the context in which they were writing, they were very much inspired, as we have discussed, by the French Revolution and its immediate aftermath of political repression in Britain. So as we discussed, Wordsworth, for instance, looked to nature as a way to deal with the ills that he was experiencing in modern society. It was his turn to nature and his celebration of childhood, of not only the natural world, but it's what it says about the divinity of humanity in relation to the natural world, his proposal to democratize language. So all of these were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. But towards his later years, Wordsworth turned more right wing, uh, at least from the perspective of the later Romantics, who were the generation that came after these older Romantics. Wordsworth, in his later years, became more known as a poet and became part of the establishment that he was criticizing in his earlier years, along with Coleridge and Blake. As I mentioned, I think in the lecture that I uploaded, Blake wasn't really known as a poet during his time. He was better known as a visual artist, and he died not being renowned as a poet. Coleridge also died kind of earlier than expected because of his addictions, and he fell ill. So it was Wordsworth who had the misfortune to grow old and to be scorned by the poets that came after him. So the later Romantics, which include Keats, Shelley, and Byron, who we are discussing today, they sought to innovate forms. They sought a break with the past, here conceived as the school of poetry that Wordsworth and the Lake poets embodied. So they sought to differentiate themselves and their aesthetics from this past aesthetics that was promoted by Wordsworth et al. And they did that by looking towards classical forms of literature, looking towards antiquity, looking towards continental literary traditions, and to innovate new forms out of that. So, for example, Ozymandias is written as in the form using the form of a sonnet, which traditionally in the Petrarchan tradition, at least, is a form that is associated with romantic love. But instead of speaking about romantic love, Ozymandias deals with concerns of politics. Or, for example, the use of these later romantics of blank verse, which is associated with Shakespeare, their use of Spenserian stanzas, they're being influenced by Milton a lot. So instead of turning to more free verse, as Wordsworth did, they sought to look towards the past in the search of something new. So for Wordsworth, imagination consisted in communing with nature, recollecting past experiences, recollecting the spontaneous overflow of feelings as filtered through the wisdom of time and of age. But these later romantics did not have that kind of nostalgic bent. For them, they were very much in the present. They were very much reacting to the political currents of the time. But their response to the present was to look towards the past in order to innovate something new. So that's something that distinguishes the early versus the late romantics in terms of form, of poetic forms. The later romantics were not as concerned with avoiding classical forms or avoiding allusion, as you may have noticed. And the poems that we will be revising today are full of allusions, especially to classical antiquity. Another thing that distinguishes the early Romantics from the late Romantics is the cosmopolitanism of the late Romantics. One factor for that is because by the time that they became active in the literary scene, the Napoleonic Wars had ended. The Napoleonic Wars began in 1801 to 1803. Britain was involved in 1803, and Britain helped with the fall of Napoleon in Waterloo. So the conclusion of those wars, which affected most of Europe during that time, meant that these British romantics had more opportunity to travel abroad because the war was over. They weren't as restricted. Their mobility was not as restricted, so they had access to traditions from the continent. And actually, Shelley lived a lot of his time outside Britain. He lived a lot in Italy, and Byron also often visited him there. Byron also, as many of you mentioned, some of you, not many of you, some of you mentioned in the annotation exercise, Byron also participated in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. So Byron especially spent a lot of his time in Europe, traveling in across the Mediterranean Sea, traveling in Portugal, in Italy, in France, in Germany. So he was just all over the place, Europe. So during their travels and during their exposure to these other languages, other literary traditions, other histories, they imbibed those cultural influences and brought them to their poetry. So, for example, Ozymandias begins with, which was written in Italy, by the way. It was written in Italy, not in Britain. So, for example, Ozymandias in England, 1819. So, Ozymandias begins with this notion of a traveler who hears something from another traveler. So, there is this imaginary in their poems of the broader world of traveling, of mobility. Contrast that with Wordsworth. So, during Wordsworth's time, as I discussed in the introduction to the Romantic period, there was a sense of the need to foster a notion of Englishness, a notion of nation. And this was a byproduct, an influence of the French Revolution. So before the French Revolution, the Kingdom of France was not really a nation state, so to speak. It was a collection of different smaller polities ruled by a king. The king had subjects. The subjects were subjected to the king, to the aristocracy. They were not a sovereign people, they were subjects. So in that transition from the subject, the ruled, to becoming the sovereign people, the rulers of their own destiny, emerges the idea of nation. So that was one outcome of the French Revolution, the emergence of the idea of nation as a collective entity. And this was also something that influenced the poetry of Wordsworth, who began to search for a notion of the English nation, a notion of Englishness. And if one reads the Wordsworth's body of poetry, he locates Englishness in the pastoral landscapes of the English nation. So you have a lot of poems about the countryside, the peasantry, the common folk, etc. This concern with Englishness comes to be less important for the later Romantics, who again are more cosmopolitan in their outlook. Of course, although they're more cosmopolitan in outlook because of their cultural consumption, I have to remember to mention the distinction between Keats and Shelley and Byron. Because while Byron and Shelley were members of the aristocracy, members of the upper class, both of these guys went to Cambridge, although they didn't finish their degrees. Shelley was expelled for promoting atheism in college. So these other guys, they're part of the upper classes, whereas Keats was was like William Blake, part of the working class. So he wasn't really he didn't have the same privileges that these other guys had. He didn't live, except for a brief period in the last year of his life, he didn't live outside of England. He was mostly based in London. So when we read the poems of Keats about autumn, about the nightingale, etc., about Chapman's Homer, about the Grecian urn. These are things that he imbibed by reading expansively, because he wasn't able to travel expansively because he was a man of limited means, and also he was suffering from ill health for most of his life. He died at 25, at the very young age of 25, of tuberculosis. So for the most of his adulthood, he was confined, not confined to bed, but his mobility was limited. So that's something that distinguishes him, Keats, from Byron and Shelley. So, so reactions to the French Revolution, cosmopolitanism versus Englishness, the search for new forms from the old classical forms. These are things that characterize the late Romantics. Let's go to the notion of the Byronic hero, which comes from Byron. A lot of the stereotypes that we have about artists that persist to this day. For example, if you attend UP Writers Night, or I don't know what artists do these days, but during my time, like, to be an artist was, to live a kind of bohemian lifestyle, to be somewhat of a rebel, to be engaged in sex, drugs, alcohol, and all of these things. To be an artist was to live fast and die young. To be an artist was to try everything at least once. This idea of rebellion against the forms and institutions of polite society, this idea of rebellion against what we now think of as bourgeois middle class values of security, stability, order, propriety, etc. Many of our ideas of what the artist is like, what an artistic character is like, comes from the Romantics. One of these characteristics relates to this notion of the Byronic hero, which is based on the image of Byron himself. Byron was somewhat of a celebrity during his time. He was somewhat of a bestseller during this time. During his time, he was haunted by this cult of personality. He was a very popular writer. His poem Child Harold's Pilgrimage was his time's version of a bestseller. And he was a bestseller not only in England, but also in the continent, where he was also traveling widely. He was also celebrated as a hero because of his efforts in supporting the Greek fight for independence. He was part of this group that tried to raise funds to fund the revolution, and he also actively participated in that fight. And actually, he died because of a fever that he got while participating in that fight. So the Byronic hero comes from his popular best-selling long narrative poem Child Harold's Pilgrimage. And usually when we think of the Byronic hero, this is a young man who is a young man who is angsty, melancholic, who is world weary in a way, who is tired of the entertainments and superficiality of his privileged life, and tries to deal with that angst and that dissatisfaction by traveling abroad and looking for adventure and looking for higher causes to commit himself to. So this idea of the Byronic hero that was embodied in the poem Child Harold's Pilgrimage was something that was often attributed to Byron himself. Because a lot of people who read Byron tried to connect his biographical profile with that of his persona in the poem. Because he was also quite popular with the ladies. If you look for Byron's picture on the internet, he was quite handsome. And of course, he was an aristocrat. So that did a lot also for the sales of his books. So he was charismatic, he was aristocratic, he was handsome, etc. He was very popular with the ladies and with the gentlemen. Byron was bisexual. So he was very popular. And during that time, he was often identified with the characters of his work. So this this identification of the artist with the persona, this cult of personality that permeated Byron's literary reception was something that might might have influence, no, not influence, but something that we still see in the way that fandom culture uh, works, in the way that groupies work. So it's something that is influential with that. What I wanted to emphasize in the feedback that you gave was this idea of rebellion against authority, even if it means the sacrifice of oneself, which is very characteristic of the Romantic period as well. This is a recurrent theme, although we discussed that the Romantic period is not one unified totality, that even the label of the Romantic was something that they never used for themselves, but was just used to label them after the fact. Even though there is no one totalizing characteristic for all of the romantics. They all have their own colors or characteristics, so to speak. There are some recurrent themes. And one of those themes would be the rebellion or resistance against authority and institutions, social institutions that are perceived to be repressive, that are perceived to be abusive and exploitative. So it's interesting here that even the aristocrat, Lord Byron, would write a poem like Prometheus, which is about rebelling against that authority in the interests of humanity, in the interests of the higher good. Yeah, so that's one theme that recurs, and we see that especially in Blake. I think, if you recall, many of the poems that we discussed from the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience are very much concerned with social inequalities. The Songs of Experience, especially, express a lot of anger about these social inequalities. So Prometheus. As one of you mentioned here in the annotation exercise, Prometheus was also a famous, not famous, Prometheus was also a significant figure for the Romantics. And as I mentioned earlier, one reason for that is because the later Romantics read very widely in classical literature and drew a lot of their poetic inspiration from classical literature. One reason also for their fascination for classical Greek literature relates to their fascination with the ideal of Athenian democracy as a basis of Western civilization. So their ideas of democracy is rooted in their appreciation of the idealized agora or deliberation in public that characterized Athenian democracy. Of course, that's a very idealized notion already because in Athenian democracy, slaves were not permitted to have a political voice. Women and children were not permitted to have a political voice. Lower class men were not given a political voice. So it's usually just the upper class men who had a political voice. But the structure of deliberation, the structure of coming together and speaking to one another, that was also something that captured the imagination of the late Romantics, especially their ideas about democracy. So that's also one reason for why they are so fascinated with these Greek classical figures. So Prometheus comes from that. Ozymandias, of course, as many of you noted, is based on Ramses II, who was known as a tyrannical Egyptian pharaoh. So that brings me to the so-called Satanic Shelley. The later Romantics, again, were not called Romantics by their contemporaries, but Byron and Shelley were called or were lumped in the so-called Satanic school because of the way that they lived their lives. Byron was embroiled in a lot of scandals with men, women, with his sister. He was embroiled in a lot of this scandalous gossip about his sexual relations with people. So Byron and Shelley were lumped in the Satanic school because of their libertarian ways, their rebellion against conservative religious norms. Shelley, when he was young, eloped with two sisters to Italy He also had an adulterous relationship. He fell in love with the daughter of his mentor, and while he was already married, so he broke off his earlier marriage and then eloped with Mary to Italy, etc. So Byron and Shelley were characterized by their pursuit of bohemian lifestyles that went against the usual norms of conservative British society. And that could also partly explain why they spent a lot of their time outside of England, to be able to pursue how they wanted to live their lives. So Satanic Shelley is just a label. But he was famous for having written these very political poems, Ozymandias and England in 1819. So Ozymandias was written after he went to see an exhibition in the British Museum of because the British Museum was able to acquire a bust or a torso of the sculpture of an Egyptian pharaoh, and upon seeing that artwork, Shelley had a contest with his friends and they wrote poems about this artwork. This is something also that uh, we see in Keats when this practice of using an existing artwork in order to write a new artwork, or this practice of writing something literary um, using a visual inspiration, be it a painting or a sculpture. This was a practice called ekphrasis, ekphrasis, ekphrasis. So this is a literary device of writing a vivid description of a visual work. So Ozymandias could be an example of that, and Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn is definitely an example of ekphrasis. And this, of course, was enabled only because of the expansion of these other fields of history, archaeology, the setting up of the British Museum and its ability to acquire pieces from all over the world, which is tied to the expansion also of the British Empire and of British mercantilism. So these things informed the cosmopolitanism and the artistic practice of the later Romantics. So Ozymandias. Similar to Prometheus, Ozymandias expresses some kind of resistance to power. But it's interesting because it uses artwork and the artist as a medium of that resistance. I'll just read Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So it's like on the one level, Shelley is mocking this. Shelley is mocking the hubris, the pride of this tyrannical figure, who seems to think that his power is going to last forever. But in the end, that power is taken away by time. Is dissolved in time. That power is becomes nothing. Like it's just enveloped in a deserted land, enveloped by dust in a deserted land. So that pride about power in the end comes to nothing. So on the one level, Shelley is making fun of that. Like you think you're dominant now, you think you have the power now, but in time that power will also disappear. But on another level, he's also celebrating the work of the artist who did the sculpture. So he, again, the lines say, uh, the visage whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survived, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked him and the heart that fed. So Here, this could be read as a reference to the role of the artist and their relationship with power. So often, if you are to make, at least during this time, if you are an artist and you want to make a living, often you had to rely on the patronage of somebody who's powerful. And of course, people in power would like to have their image presented in such a way as to emphasize their goodness or their authority. So the poem brings to mind how sometimes artists are complicit in whitewashing, so to speak, the evils of power. I'm reminded here of the portraits, the many portraits that were commissioned by the dictator Marcos and Imelda, and how artists presented them as malakas and maganda, or how artists, writers, advertising agents, what do you call them? Yeah, creatives. Yeah, how these creatives also serve power by writing speeches for people in power, by creating propaganda for them. So this was your ancient version of propaganda, like the sculptor who had to feed, who had to make a living by using his art to glorify the ruler, the one in power. But Shelley says, if you look closely at what the sculptor did, he did not simply create this magnificent statue for the tyrant. You see that he presented the tyrant in a way that emphasized his cruelty, that emphasized his sneer of cold command. So it's like, even though even though the artist is implicated in serving power, there is that space of resistance where the artist can say something that he wants to say, can express the criticism that he wants to say, and even though he is unable to express that in his lifetime, because let's say the sculptor would have been beheaded by Ramses if he expressed dissent, in the end, the portrait of the artist survives. And the portrait or the sculpture of the artist, what the artist meant to say, survives the test of time, survives the power of the tyrant, and can be read by people in future generations. And this is something that could also be related to the long essay that Shelley wrote in defense of poetry, where, like Wordsworth, he attributes a moral role to the artist. And that's something that we see in the way that he discusses Ozymandias, the way that he writes this poem Ozymandias. England in 1819. I'm looking if anyone mentioned the Peterloo massacre. Just to set like the context of this time, at this time the king was of George III, and he was often lampooned among British publics as the mad king, because he suffered from some kind of madness. He was also a very unpopular monarch because he wasn't really English. George III came from the House of Hanover in Germany. In the 1700s, the royal houses of Hanover and Britain united, because of course all of these aristocrats in Europe were all related in some way. So he actually has roots in Germany, in Hanover in Germany. And every time his possessions in Germany were threatened by war or by conquest, the English were forced to contribute to the protection of that. And of course, war is very costly. So among the public, so they had this famine, there was rising unemployment, there was rising poverty, and then they still had to contribute to the war effort across the English Channel in the continent for a king that they did not like and who they felt was repressive towards them. So this first couple of lines, an old mad blind despised and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring. Rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop blind in blood without a blow. So it's a reaction against the abuses of the aristocracy and how they seem to just cling to their fainting country, Hanover in Germany, but also England. They cling to power in England, even though they don't seem to care about their people. They're described as a leech-like people. So the aristocracy is a leech upon the English people, and they are lampooned in the public. Uh, the dull race is a reference also to hereditary congenital diseases that plagued the House of Hanover because they were intermarrying with cousins, etc. So they had some abnormalities. So the first few lines, first one, two, three, four, five, six first lines, expresses that criticism against power. And then we come to a people starved and stabbed in the untilled field, which is a reference to the Peterloo massacre. An army whom liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed, a senate, time-worst statute unrepealed, are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. So the next few, the next lines after the till they drop blind and blood without a blow, the next lines are a reference to the Peterloo massacre where 60,000 people were protesting and the cavalry charged into them and killed about 18 people. Why were they? Peterloo is the name of a town in Manchester, in the industrial city of Manchester in Lancashire. So why were the people assembled there? They wanted universal male suffrage because during this time, less than 11% of the British populace were able to have a voice in Parliament, and that's because only men of a certain property. So you had to have a certain amount of holdings, property holdings, in order to have a voice in parliament. So the people in Peterloo were protesting to support universal suffrage for men. And this was seen as a threat by the monarchy, by the aristocracy, who of course wanted to continue dominating parliament to protect their own interests. So they sent the cavalry there. Cavalry are soldiers that have horses. So if you have a horse, you can easily stomp on people. From up on high, you can easily use swords to charge into people and subdue them. So the Peterloo massacre was considered the bloodiest event in the 19th century in English soil. Of course, such barbarity happened routinely in wars abroad or in colonial conquests abroad, but in English soil, it was a big thing. It was a huge thing. So that was the event that inspired England 1819. It was like the ultimate expression of how much power did not care about the concerns of the masses, so to speak, the concerns of the masses of English people. This poem actually made me think of the event a few years back during Noy Noy's time, the Bigas Hindi Bala protest, when you had farmers in Mindanao protesting to get more ayuda from the DSWD, and then the police fired on them. So if you want to kind of relate it to a local context, it could be it's something like that, like people peacefully protesting for the expansion of their rights and then getting gunned down or getting charged into with swords and bayonets, etc. So here in this poem in England 1819, we see Shelley attacking not just the institution of the monarchy and the aristocracy, but he attacks the army, he attacks laws which he thinks are unjust, he attacks religion, which in this context serves power instead of the people. He attacks the Senate. So these are very political poem. When we think of like the popular stereotype of the romantics were that they were these bohemian, brooding, introspective young men. Like the Byronic hero is that he is brooding and he is angsty and he's looking for something more, but he's like melancholic, addicted to entertainments or to drugs or to opium, etc. But here we see in the romantics also a very strong sense of social consciousness, of political consciousness, and a lot of their work, even though they seem kind of innocuous, like Blake's poetry, which is inspired by children's literature. The poems, the forms don't seem that political, but the concerns are very much informed by the politics of the time, what was happening at the time.